At first glance, the Warhammer 40,000 franchise seems to be one characterized by its bombastic, over-the-top action. Tales of heroism and valor are commonplace and always set against a backdrop of a galaxy plagued by never-ending war. The vast majority of the time, our primary lens into this grimdark future is told through the eyes of 8-foot-tall demigods that are both nearly invincible and gifted with the best weapons and armor humanity can produce, meaning that it's often difficult for the audience to feel any kind of fear for them. It is, however, when you start to look outside of this framework, when you start to probe the dark places between stars, that you realize this is all a facade. For the quintillions of regular, unaugmented men and women living in the 41st millennium, their lives are nothing less than a horror story. One where the nightmare of their existence is plagued by the alien, the witch, the heretic, and the mutant, eldritch abominations beyond mortal comprehension that prey upon the flesh of men. What I'm trying to say is 40K is the absolute perfect setting for some downright bone-chilling horror stories. And here in the Grimdark Story Hour, we're going to be shedding light on all the dark corners of the galaxy, one macabre tale at a time. Today's story is Elloth 9 by Justin D. Hill, released in October of 2021 and included in the Warhammer horror anthology Accursed. There will be a link in the description below if you would like to support the original release. The story follows a group of ex-gangers turned void miners that have taken a job that seems too good to be true, mining asteroids out in Deadhenge. The only issue, the previous crew whom they've been sent to replace vanished under mysterious circumstances. He doesn't realize it at the time, but Elloth Koru, the gang leader, as well as the men and women under his command, have just crossed the threshold into a realm of madness and insanity. Despite the strange circumstances they find themselves in, they will soon come to realize they are not alone, as an ancient presence is watching them from the shadows. He will have to piece together what happened here before his sanity reaches the breaking point and he and his crew end up the haunted void station's next victims. This story was excellent. It's a bit of a slow burn at first, but once it gets going, it keeps ratcheting up the intensity until it crescendos in a bone-chilling ending that left me with so many questions I was thinking about it for weeks. So gather round, my friends, dim the lights and get comfortable as we settle in for another macabre and spooky entry in the Grimdark Story Hour. But before we get started, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor. Today's sponsor is Factor, who helps you meet your nutritional goals by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep, all crafted by their team of gourmet chefs using only ingredients with integrity that help you feel your best all day long. I've been using Factor for about a year now, and not only do I love just how delicious all of their food is, but I love just how much time they've saved me. Factor takes all of the stress out of meal planning and helps you save time by skipping on trips to the grocery store, as well as cutting down on prep work and cleanup. You get to choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, including meals for every lifestyle. Whether you're counting calories, keto, vegetarian, vegan, etc., Factor's got something for everyone. They've got more than 60 add-ons each and every week, like breakfast, on-the-go lunches, snacks, and beverages to help you stay fueled and feeling good all day. So why not skip on the takeout trap, as Factor is cheaper, better for you, and far more delicious anyways. Head on over to Factor75.com or click on the link below and use code WESHAMMER50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month's order. That's code WESHAMMER50 at Factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month's order. Big thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video. Our story begins with Elloth Koru and the rest of his crew sweeping through the abandoned mining station of Elloth 9 for any evidence relating to the previous crew's disappearance. As they made their way into the kitchen, they discovered row upon row of half-eaten bowls of food and even a pot still on the stove, its contents having long ago turned into a gelatinous slab. Elloth went to lift the ladle sticking out of the pot, and the entire thing came up, coming loose with a squelching sound before dropping and clattering across the floor.
Ah, bastards. Get rid of that Toyn.
Toyn turned to Zalin. You heard him, get rid of it. Zalin cursed under his breath, but did as he was told nonetheless. Elloth was the gang leader after all, and Toyn was his second in command. The Void Miners had always been a hierarchical lot. In fairness though, Elloth had the most experience out of any of them. It had been him who landed this lucrative gig for all of them in the first place. Work for former gangers wasn't always easy to come by, and this job in particular was paying far more than the average rate for mining work. Elloth had hand-selected each and every one of them for their skills and had helped all of them turn their lives around. Whereas the others were simply happy for work, Elloth had his suspicions that the company suits weren't telling him something. He kept it to himself, but if there was one thing he had learned during his time taking mining jobs out in Deadhenge, it was that the bosses only offered extra pay like this when there was something seriously wrong with the operation. In fairness, he always ran his crew on a need-to-know basis. Whatever the bosses were hiding, they figured he wasn't on the need-to-know list. This was a mindset that, although annoying, he could at least respect. He made his way towards the barracks and punched in his access code. The panel door slid open with a hiss of equalizing pressure to reveal a long metal corridor. Like with everywhere else aboard the station, there were no signs of life, save a hissing servitor set into an alcove in the wall at the far end. He moved inside, his broad shoulders only just fitting in the doorway. Every member of this crew was an intimidating specimen, but Elloth was by far the biggest. Like all former Karex gangers, he was a solid slab of corded, stem-enhanced muscle, covered in age-worn scars. As he looked around, he continuously punched his fist into his meaty palm. It was an unconscious habit, but it helped him think. None of this made any sense. There was nothing obviously wrong with this facility. No power failures, no signs of physical damage, and the life support systems had remained fully operational. About a month back, all communication with the previous crew abruptly ceased, and the mining reports stopped coming in. The bosses figured something must have happened, so Elloth's team was sent to replace them. But in addition, they were here to figure out what exactly had happened. But as far as he could tell, there was nothing here. More importantly, there was nowhere for them to have gone. Their only way on or off this rig was through the warp-capable vessel that was sent to drop off the miners and wouldn't be back for another 6 months. There were no escape pods or anything like that, as there was no need. There wasn't anything out here except for asteroid belts and dead planets orbiting even deader stars. The closest refuge was hundreds of light years away. His gaze shifted over to the servitor in the wall, and a look of disgust crept across his face. Elloth had always hated these things, and never understood why their use was so accepted by the God-fearing people of the Imperium. These lobotomized servants were always made from heretics or criminals that had been condemned to an existence of biological serfdom. The process of turning them into one of these things may have purged them of their sins, but so too did it strip away everything that made them them. All traces of humanity scrubbed away and their remaining organs used until they reached their natural death. This servitor was nothing more than a torso. Its arms had been replaced with a series of cables that better connected it into its station. Tubes ran from its eye sockets, and thick ducting permanently welded its mouth shut. Aside from its ever-present hissing, it occasionally gurgled as its feeding tubes funneled nutrient-rich gruel down its throat. He leaned over it, examining its head. The holy symbol of the Aquila had been tattooed over what he assumed was an age-worn brand from a previous life that marked it as a member of some gang Elloth had never heard of. If he had to make a guess, he assumed that this thing had once been a woman. But at this point, there was no real way to tell. He cursed under his breath. This was a load of grok shit. If the other crew wanted to abandon their duties, Emperor knows for whatever stupid reason, that was their problem. But by not leaving any kind of explanation as to why for Elloth and his crew, they had now made it his. If there was something wrong with this place, something that made it dangerous, he and his crew needed to know about it. Mining out in the asteroid fields wasn't like working in the comparative safety of a mine planetside. Some faulty welding here, a pressure leak there, that kind of shit might get overlooked in an inspection somewhere else. But in the void, the tiniest crack left unfixed could lead to catastrophic consequences. The galaxy of the 41st millennium was a cruel and unforgiving mistress. The wealthy nobles and company owners looked down on people like Elloth and his crew. But fellow miners? Nah, miners always stuck together. Even if they had never met face to face, there was a mutual respect in their line of work. Or at least that's what he had always thought until today. He made his way into the living chambers. Wherever the crew had gone to, they hadn't bothered to bring any of their personal belongings with them. Not that they had much to speak of. He rummaged through stacks of old clothing and a few left behind surplus canvas holders, but didn't find any clues. His search eventually took him into a nearby restroom. The walls were made of beaten metal, and it looked like somebody had crudely scratched the word Volgast into one of them. Now, whether that was a planet or somebody's name, he had no idea. He looked around and saw some crude seats made from sacks that had been stuffed with synth-wool fiber, but one of them looked a little lopsided. He walked over to it and peeled back the sacking. Stuck down the back of the chair was a simple pict of the God Emperor. It wasn't anything of any particular value, just a cheap print of a stern-faced man rimmed by a golden halo. But there was something wrong with the Emperor's eyes. Someone had scratched them out. Defacing an image of the God Emperor, even just an old faded pic like this, was an act of heresy. Elloth had seen a lot of terrible things in his life, things that would certainly break weaker men. But something about that pic just creeped him the hell out. He started to think to himself that maybe it was a good thing they didn't meet the previous crew after all. Toyne followed him inside. "You find anything?"
No, nothing. This area's clear,"
he said, and without thinking, he folded the pic up and slid it in his back pocket. By this point, his team had been searching for several hours, and they decided to call it quits. Elloth headed back to the hangar deck, where Moez, another of his appointed overseers, was supervising the unloading of a penance. He was second in size to Elloth, but only barely. A pair of lifter sentinels was assisting with unpacking everything the crew was going to need over the next 6 months. "Hey, don't worry about us, boss. We're all good here," he said. Elloth gave him a brief nod in acknowledgement and then turned his attention to a nearby data point. He punched in his access key and began the process of introducing himself to the station's machine spirit. The ancient cogitator's word to life, and after a few moments, his retinal display successfully paired with the facility's logic circuits. He was bombarded by a stream of near-endless data as dozens of servitors all across the station began feeding him their reports. Oxygen levels, temperatures, void seals, and an endless stream of redundant information washed over him like a crimson sea of ones and zeros. No matter how many times he did this, the sensation always was a little overwhelming, but he quickly got used to it and began to process all of it. "Did you find anything in there?"
That's just as we thought. Facility's functioning correctly, but the crew logs are all blank.
"What do you mean, blank?"
It looks like they scrubbed them.
He'd encountered simple data blocks like this in the past, and luckily had picked up a few tricks in order to bypass them. But one after another, as he punched in his bypass codes, each and every one of them failed, coming back over and over with the same message: access denied. Realizing that he wasn't going to get anywhere, he unplugged from the system and turned back to Moez.
All right then. First job's to check this rig's been left in good order. No mining until we've got this place run through. I want every last inch inspected, understood?
They split into 2 groups, one team led by Elloth and the other by Toyne, each searching for any kind of damage. But they couldn't find anything, and after a few hours, they decided to refocus their efforts on bringing everything else online. The confusing circumstances of this new job had left the crew with dour spirits, but thankfully that all turned around when they got the mining started. Once they had something to focus on, it all quickly dissipated and spirits were brought back up. Elloth's team was to take the first shift. They made their way to the top of the mine shaft and worked in pairs to check each other's void suits, secure their helmets, and make sure the Vox links were all operational. They each took their places in the conveyor and waited for their descent down to the asteroid's surface to begin. There was a lurch as their carriage broke free, followed by a second a few minutes later as the grav dampeners kicked in to slow their fall. Finally, the carriage came to a halt. With a hiss, the doors opened, and they all stepped out onto the surface of the asteroid. Void mining was something that they had all had experience with, but after you've seen a couple dozen asteroids, they stop becoming special. They all look exactly the same. They're dark, icy, metallic places pitted with gnarled surfaces. Nothing but big, lonely rocks floating in the void. But this one was different. Not only was it polished and smooth, but its color didn't make any sense. It was as white as bleached bone, and reflected the light of distant stars by a shocking amount. As they stepped out onto its surface, clouds of talc-like powder broke free with every step, clinging to their suits in a dusty covering. None of them had ever seen anything like it. It felt unnatural, and just being here made them all feel uneasy. Elloth felt a distressing feeling of complete and utter emptiness wrap its icy fingers around his heart. Zalin turned to Elloth and activated his Vox link. "I don't like this." Elloth said nothing in return, but gave him a look that communicated the feeling was mutual. The entrance to the mineshaft was 100 yards below them, so the group made their way down a series of scaffolded steps and suspended crossways. Looking over the edge, they were able to stare down directly into the asteroid's core. It was glowing. Something out of sight and far below them was radiating an eerie green corpse light. "I really don't like this," Zalin said.
Pull yourself together.
Elloth snapped.
We got quotas to hit, and we won't reach them getting spooked by some bloody lights.
The team only had about 2 hours to work, and it took them half of that just to get everything set up. They were going to have to work double time in order to not fall behind. or worse, have dinner that night soured by the endless bitching of second shift. When the time came, everyone got into position, and Elloth signaled to Toyne in the drill cabin to start up the machine. With a sputter of black promethium fumes, the great beast was brought up to full power, and its roar filled the chamber. That's when he heard it. A persistent tapping sound, like broken fingernails against plexiglass. He couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Fearing something might be wrong with the drill, he signaled for Toyne to kill the engine. What is it? What's the matter?
Can you hear that?
He said once the noise of the drill had died down. What? She shook her head.
That tapping sound.
He looked around at the rest of his crew, but their confused faces indicated that no one else had heard anything. Believing he must have imagined it, he waved his hand dismissively for them to start the drill up again. There was a clunk as the gears were engaged. Slowly, the gnarled steel teeth began to spin. Later that night, Elloth and several of the male gang members were eating dinner in the mess hall when the click of his Vox feed went off. He put his finger in his ear and rose his voice as he always did when speaking over the Vox. It was Toyne.
What did you just say? Repeat that.
Sensing the change in the atmosphere, Zalin looked over at him. What's up?
That's nothing,
he said, getting up from his chair and heading out of the room. He'd always run his crew on a need-to-know basis, and from his perspective, they didn't need to know much to do their job of blasting and boring. They certainly didn't need to know about this. He got to the cargo bay and was immediately struck by the metallic scent of old iron. It was eerily quiet, the only sound being Elloth's footsteps that reverberated ominously against the metal flooring. The only light came from a few flickering lumens overhead. Up ahead, he saw Toyne pointing her lumen at something nailed to the underside of one of the immense mining hoppers. There was no mistaking it. It looked exactly like a body, one that had been wrapped in canvas sheeting, bound with ship rope, and then nailed up with rivets. It was eerily reminiscent to how those who died in the void were traditionally prepared for burial. But this one had been left in such an odd place, it just didn't make any sense. Elloth stood there looking up at it and was filled with a deep feeling of wrongness. The entire scene reeked of ritual significance. I was awake and just thought I'd have a look around. It seems like an odd place to leave a body.
Let's get it down.
She took out a long gang knife and slashed the bindings, letting the body fall free into Elloth's arms, who noted that it felt strangely light. He set the bundle on the floor so they could get a better look at it, reaching out to peel away the wrappings at the top to reveal the body's face. Whoever this person had been had clearly died centuries ago. The skin had mummified and was stretched across its skull like brittle paper. Although he was no doctor, it was plain to Elloth that the manner of execution had been particularly brutal. Half of its cranium had been caved in, and there was a tight, lacerating garrote wrapped so tightly around its neck that it had bit deep into the ghoul's flesh. Whoever the killer was must have decided that the other injuries had not been sufficient, as the throat had also been violently slashed open. Its final moments had been captured forever in a permanent snarl of pain and hatred, stretched wide across its face, exposing a row of broken, rotten teeth. As if to add even further insult, the cadaver's eyes were missing. They looked like they had been gouged out with a crude instrument. The hollow sockets stared back at him like a pair of black holes, a mirror into an infinite well of madness that pierced his very soul. Elloth was no stranger to death and had seen many dead bodies in his past life as a ganger, but none of them had ever made him feel quite as uneasy as this thing did.
I don't understand. Why didn't they just vent it?
Void miners lived incredibly dangerous lives, and their bosses operated with a brutal set of laws that didn't afford any dignity to the dead, or, in many cases, even the living. Venting a corpse or a troublemaker was the simplest form of burial or execution that existed. He bent down to get a better look, and although the parchment strips were blank, he knew he had recognized them. It was the same material used in the creation of prayer scrolls common amongst the Emperor's faithful. The symbol of the Holy Aquila had been carved into its forehead, but was now warped and stretched by time. I don't know, but let's vent it now. Thing gives me the creeps, Toyne said. He checked his retinal display. The nearest airlock was 5 levels above them. According to the data, it hadn't actually been opened in nearly 5 centuries. He picked the body up and threw it over his shoulder, indicating to Toyne to lead the way. A little while later, they arrived and opened the airlock. A frigid blast of air greeted them as if it had been holding its breath in anticipation of this very moment. He dumped the body and backed out of the room, Toyne punched in the access codes and the door slid shut. "In the name of the Emperor," she said as she struck the activation rune and vented the corpse out into the void. Elloth stood there watching from the viewport as the shrouded body tumbled out and drifted away into the darkness. Several days went by without incident. The crew worked quickly to make up for lost time, and their efforts were proving quite fruitful. At this point, they were well ahead of schedule. In acknowledgement of their hard work, Elloth gave the all clear for extra food rations for everyone, including a protein slab and an extra ration of grog. Later that night, after she had finished her meal, Toyne headed out of the mess hall looking for Elloth. For some reason, he hadn't decided to eat with them, which struck her as odd. She didn't have to go far though, as she found him leaned up against the wall right outside of the mess hall's entrance, as if he had been waiting for her. His eyes were wide, and his hand was pressed to his forehead in a sign of complete bewilderment. "What's up with you? You all right?"
Follow me. You need to see this.
Together, they made their way to the cold store where he unlocked the door and pulled it open. A mist of frozen air rolled out in response. At first, everything seemed normal enough. The open shelves were piled with tubs of oil, and there was a huge slab of grox meat hanging from a hook in the center of the room. But as her attention drifted downward, she saw what had Elloth so worried. It was another body, wrapped in canvas and bound with ship rope. "Another one?" she asked. He gave her a look, his eyes hard set and an uncharacteristic grimace stretched across his lips. He walked forward into the freezer, around the other side of the corpse, and pointed down at its face. There it was, the exact same desecrated creature staring back up at them with cold, hollow eyes. "It can't be."
Yeah, but it is.
"That's impossible. We vented it," she said. They both examined it, looking for any bit of evidence that would assuage the fear they felt welling up inside them. But the wounds were all the same. The garrote, the slashed throat, the dry lips pulled back over broken teeth. It was an exact match. They stood there together, looking down at the impossible lying at their feet, an impossibility wrapped in canvas and marked with the holy sign of the Aquila. Later that night, Elloth awoke to the sound of a woman's scream echoing down the corridor. He sat bolt upright in his cot.
Toyne!
He called out, but there was no response. The only sound he heard was a strange tapping that sounded like it was coming from the lower decks, like something was trying to get in. He slammed on the lights, grabbed his suit, and started ruffling through his chest beneath the cot. He didn't have much that was really worth anything. Some old clothes, stacks of credit chits, lucky tokens, and a few fading pick prints of women he had fallen in and out with along the way. But at the bottom, wrapped in a bundle, was a sawn-off rivet gun, a solid piece favored by the stem gangers of Camp Carax. He checked the ammo counter and saw that it was full of blunt steel slugs. He slid the firearm into his waistband and headed out. If there was a stowaway aboard, he wasn't going to run into them unarmed. He made his way through the station, following the faint sound of tapping. As he proceeded down several flights of zigzagging stairs, the sound gradually grew louder and louder until he was standing in front of the generatorium. He put his ear against the heavy metal doors and listened. The air vibrated with the rumble of the plasma reactor and the coolants within, but the noise was definitely coming from the other side. He used a nearby thumbpad to open the door and made his way in. The generatorium was a dimly lit zone of tangled duct piping, narrow walkways, and exposed cabling. It was Elloth's belief that whoever built this place did so with some form of logic, but decades of on-the-job repairs had turned the standard template construct into a mess of bypasses, sections of dead cabling, and pipes that leaked dark fluid. Making his way through was difficult. It was like trying to move through the ship's guts. All of the loose cables, ancient ducting, and exposed wires appeared to him like a mess of intestines. But it didn't matter. The tapping, which had now taken on the sound of a tolling bell, was definitely coming from somewhere within this techno-labyrinth. He slipped sideways through a mess of tangled hosing and made his way deeper inside. Pneumatic valves hissed around him, and for a moment he was blinded as a coolant pipe valve released a plume of vapor downwards in front of him. The tolling had now become insistent. He started to hurry, a prickle of fear making the hair on the back of his neck stand at attention. Suddenly, he sensed movement to his left, and the moment he turned to look at it, something leapt out at him from the darkness. He stumbled backwards in panic, loops of heavy cabling enveloping him like the folds of a serpent. He battered them away and brought his weapon to bear. But before him was only a servitor console that had been buried in the pipework. The thing looked like it was dead. It was lying face down in a pool of its own blood. He He started to back away from it when its face suddenly jerked upright and stared right at him. Its nose was a crushed smear, and from its ruined nostrils, bright gouts of fresh arterial blood gushed, mixing with the days-old gore. In a jerking motion, it sat upright and stared at him with bloodshot eyes. For a moment, Elloth imagined that it looked like it was pleading for help. Before he could react, the servitor suddenly slammed its face down into the console before it, with such force that Elloth could hear bones cracking as blood splattered against his cheek. Apparently unfazed by the self-inflicted damage, the creature raised its head again and stared at him, its eyes now a ruined mess. After a moment's pause, it repeated the action, slamming its head down into the console in time to the tolling bell. The skin of its cheek split down to the bone, and it raised up its head for a third time.
Stop!
Elloth shouted, but there was something almost willful to the horrifying display. It slammed down again and again, its face further being reduced to a tangled mess of gore and broken bone. As it reared up again, Elloth lunged out and grabbed the nutrient tube that had replaced its throat. It was thick, like a ribbed windpipe. He put his spare hand into the bloody mess of the servitor's face, pushed back and pulled with all his might, but it was stuck tight. Feeling the servitor's muscles clench for another slam, he put his boot on its chest and pulled again. With a wet, ripping sound, the nutrient tube tore free, spraying a gray, gelatinous gruel all over him. The creature stared at him, its eyes bloody and blank, its torn mouth hanging loosely open. After a moment passed, it slammed down again, nutrient paste mixing with the gore. He shouted at it again to stop, but of course there was no understanding. He gripped the skull in both hands and used his stem-bulked muscles to drive the head down with such force that he felt the dome of the skull shatter. He didn't wait for it to rear up again. He lifted it up and smashed it down again, causing the servitor to gargle blood with the stitched remains of its tongue. Whether they were words of pain or reproach, Elloth didn't care. His fingers clawed into the servitor's brain as he rammed it down again and again. At last, with a shout of pure fury, he twisted the head so sharply that it almost came free in his hand. Mercifully, the servitor finally lulled back and stirred no more. By the time Elloth was making it back to the hab deck, he heard the telltale signs of his crew preparing for their morning shift. Had he been out all night? He wasn't sure. As the others made their way down the corridor, Elloth ducked out of sight. He didn't want to have to explain what had happened or why he was covered in blood. There was nothing to explain. There had been an issue and he fixed it. A faulty piece of equipment. That was all. He moved inside of the latrine and locked the door, then hammered down on the water stud, which caused a thin trickle of recyc that smelled faintly of urine to come out. Pushing his sleeves up, he washed up to his elbows. The blood came away easily, but it was the pulpy chunks of brain matter under his fingernails that were the most difficult to remove. After about 5 minutes of washing, the klaxon rang out, signaling the upcoming shift was to begin in 10 minutes. With a sleep-deprived sigh, he splashed water over his face and looked at himself in the polished steel mirror. His image was cloudy and distorted as the mirror had been stained on numerous occasions and had been discolored by age, but he could clearly see that he didn't look well. As he stood there staring at himself, his vision began to blur, and for just a brief moment, the stains in the mirror seemed to coalesce into a figure, one with a desiccated face and hollow eyes. He blinked and looked again, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, there was a pounding on the door that caused him to jump. He turned around and opened it. It was Toyne, who greeted him with a weary look. "Shift starting," she said. He was tense. He couldn't get the image of the servitor's ruined face out of his mind. Not only that, but the tapping sound had resumed. As he went through his day, he would try to bring it up with the other miners, but their response was always the same. No one else could hear it. In the end, he just stopped talking about it, even though it never truly went away. The story jumps forward a few days, and we find Elloth and Toyne at the bottom of the conveyor at the end of a hard shift. "Hey, everything all right with you, big guy?"
I'm fine.
He snapped. "You don't look fine. You look sick,"
It's nothing.
Elloth said, waving a hand at her.
Honest, I just need sleep.
Afterwards, he stumbled back to his cell and bolted the door shut. He hadn't exactly lied to Toyne. It was true that the incessant tapping had kept him up night after night. At this point, the lack of sleep made him feel like he was losing his mind. No one else could hear it, which meant that it was all in his head. He just needed a good night's sleep, and come hell or high water, he was going to get it. Earlier that day, he had swiped a bottle of suppressants from the Medicaid station. He reached into his pocket and took out the bottle, shook 2 out into his hand, and then slammed him down his throat. He was out in minutes. His eyes flicked open. He was alone, The room was dark and eerily quiet. There was no tapping, not even the hum of the station's generators. There was no obvious cause for alarm, but something had jolted him awake. He looked around, his eyes blurry from having just been recently unconscious. The lumens in the ceiling began to flicker to life, momentarily blinding him as his view came back into focus. However, he saw something that made his heart stop and his veins turn to ice. There above him, nailed to the ceiling of his chamber, was the cadaver. Its mouth open in a grimace of pain. The thing moved, struggling against its bonds, all while it stared down at him with its cold, hollow eye sockets. The silence broken by the sound of old leather being twisted as its ancient body struggled to get free. He closed his eyes, daring not to look up. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real. He lay there, hands pressed over his ears, eyes closed, his mouth open in a silent scream. There was banging on the door, and Toyn's concerned voice could be heard yelling from the other side. The door slid open just a crack, just enough that she could see Elloth's face. His eyes were hollow and sunken. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days. Were you just screaming in there?
I just need rest,
he said. His voice was a croak. He would deal with these nightmares alone.
You take the team. You know the drill.
Before she could protest, he shut the door. He scrambled for his rivet gun and waited until he was sure he heard Toyn's footsteps disappear down the corridor. Then he held up the gun with fumbling hands and fired over and over. It took 7 desperate shots until its shrouded body stopped moving. He cut the thing down and dragged it along the corridor. He had to work quickly before second shift returned to the barracks. He reached the doors to the incinerator and flung the body inside, a wave of relief washing over him as the heavy metal doors closed and the locking mechanism sealed. He thumbed the power stud, and a blast of plasma lit the inside with the fire of an unchained star. He waited for the inside to cool and then, with a sigh of relief, turned to leave. That's when he heard it again, that incessant, terrible tapping coming from inside the incinerator. The window into the furnace was covered by a heavy metal clasp. He unlocked it and moved it out of the way. And there, staring at him in the porthole, was the cadaver, its hanging jaw working as if it was trying to laugh. In a panic, he slammed the plasma stud again and held it there till he could feel the heat radiating through the massive doors. At last, he vented the contents to the void. He stumbled back to his cell, hopeful that now he would finally be able to rest, when his Vox began to chime. With a sigh, he activated it. It was probably Toyn. He was sure that she'd be asking him for some kind of advice. In fairness, he couldn't really blame her. She had never taken control of the crew before, and he had kind of just thrust this on her out of nowhere. He thought to himself that he would make it up to her. He would sneak a couple of extra rations of grog for the two of them, and they would talk all about it. He only hoped that whatever it was she wanted wouldn't require him to go down there. He still needed to sleep after all. However, the voice on the other end of the line wasn't Toyn. It was Dan, one of the shot blasters. "Boss, there's been an accident." Elloth took the news with a strange sense of detachment. He had to make Dan repeat himself multiple times for it to even feel real.
What kind of accident?
He said. "Toyn's dead." There was a long pause as he processed the news in silence. It was like his entire world was shrinking in on him. He felt an icy chill on the back of his neck and every hair on his body stand at attention. Just above him, he could hear the sound of creaking leather, but he dared not look up. He coughed to clear his voice. He knew that he had to sound shocked and concerned.
What happened?
"Hydrogen bubble. Trapped within the ice. A spark from the drill set off a fireball that ripped right through the drill rig." He went on describing the entire scene. Who had been hurt, who deserved commendation, who was going to be out of action for a while, each and every detail loaded with an unsaid recrimination. This wouldn't have happened if you had only been here. The implication was clear, but all Elloth could really focus on was that incessant sound of tapping. Eventually, Dan stopped speaking and the silence rolled on. Elloth rubbed his eyes and spoke in a voice that barely seemed his own, a rasping, dry voice.
Put it in the log,
Elloth croaked. "That's it?
Yeah.
You're not coming down?
No.
You all right?"
Yes, I'm fine.
Elloth cleared his throat again. He was uncertain, but he had to reach out.
Who am I speaking to again?
"Dan," the voice said. He had known Dan for a long time. They had been through some tight spaces together.
Can you do something for me?
Elloth said. The answer came back affirmative. He put his hand to his head.
Close your eyes. Are they closed? Good. Now tell me, Can you hear anything?
No. Elloth, do you need a medic? Elloth thought that he might weep. He croaked out an answer.
No, just a little more rest.
There was another long pause.
Honest, I just need a little more rest.
They found him sometime later in his cell, lying in his cot, with his hands pressed over his ears. In walked Medic Dune. He was a borer with a teardrop tattooed under one eye and an Imperial Aquila hanging out of one of his nostrils. He had been on break smoking a low stick when the call came in. He was clearly still a bit shaken from what he had seen down there, and his yellow fingers still smelled of smoke. He sat down beside the gang captain and shined a light into both of his eyes. He took his pulse, drew some blood, and then sedated him. Elloth slept for 2 days straight. When he finally woke, Dune put him through the same test again. Moez came into the room to check on him.
How's the mining going?
Elloth asked. Moez nodded.
It's going well.
They made small talk for a while, mining stuff, ore, loads, projected bore depths, and angles for the days ahead. It seemed to Elloth that Dune, watching silently in the corner, was testing his sanity. At last, Moez said,
Hey, listen, when you were sick, you mentioned a knocking sound.
Did I?
Yeah, Dan said something about it.
He did,
Elloth said. He laughed.
I must have been trying to scare him, as if he was just a trio.
Moez smiled.
Do you still hear it?
Elloth paused and considered. After a moment, he shook his head.
No, I'm fine. I feel much better, honest.
He took a deep breath. All of this was in his head. Everything that had happened, all the things he had seen, that incessant tapping. He had just overdone it on his last furlough. It all seemed like fun and games at the time, but perhaps he had spent just a little too much time in the illicit stem bars in the scrub dens. He could get through this. He just needed to pull himself together, as if this was all somehow just a matter of willpower. The next day, he threw everything that he had into his job, furiously drilling down into the asteroid's seam. When Moez and his gang finally arrived to relieve him and his crew, he briefed them on everything that he had done, sluiced off the dust and sweat in the hygiene chamber, and returned to the habdeck. He grabbed a bite to eat and headed back to his cell, where he found Medic Dune waiting for him. He laid down on the bed as Dune went through his checklist.
I'll be honest with you. Everything looks normal. Your pressures are all fine, and I don't detect any sign of bad humors. Good,
Elloth said.
I knew I just needed a break.
He closed his eyes and feigned drifting off to sleep. Dune got up to leave the room. After the door closed behind him, Elloth lay there listening intently to the sound of the medic's footsteps as they slowly faded away. Once he was sure he was gone, his eyes shot open and he jumped out of his cot. He flung open his miner's chest and scrambled through it for his gun and the rest of his rivets. He only had a couple of shots left, so he was going to need to make them count. Despite his words otherwise, that Emperor-forsaken knocking had never ceased. Day after day, the horrible sound continued to push him further and further into madness. This was it. This was his breaking point. With his sanity holding on by mere threads, he knew that he only had one chance to make it stop for good. If he failed, it would certainly be the death of him. He made his way back to the generatorium, placing his thumb on the scanner. The airlock door hissed open and then closed behind him. He paused to let his eyes acclimate to the gloom. He was so focused on the sound of the knocking that he didn't even register the clunk of maglocks engaging behind him. He pushed deep into the coiled guts of the rig, making his way past the festering body of the dead servitor, across narrow walkways and through hundreds of yards of ruined cabling. Then finally, he found what he was looking for. There, at the end of the long and ominous corridor, was the cadaver. The shroud of canvas had been burned away by the plasma, and its naked body had been scorched black. Where before, the corpse thing had always appeared bald, it now had a mane of long white hair, like tangled spider silk, that was scorched and fraying at the tips. It was nothing more than a torso. Everything beneath its waist had been obliterated, its intestines hanging loosely behind it in bloody coiled ropes. His sweaty palms were trembling, and he clutched his rivet gun tightly. As in acknowledgement of his presence, the creature slowly lifted its head from the floor and turned to look at him. Its face had changed, whereas before its eyes had been nothing more than deep, fathomless pits of pure darkness. Now, bloodshot eyes bulged from its ancient face. To his absolute horror, he recognized those eyes. Although her skin now hung in slack sacks of wrinkled flesh, and she appeared as if she had died decades ago, there was no mistaking it. It was Toyne. Her jaw hung slack open, and she reached a decrepit hand out to him as if to beg for help.
Who are you?
He shouted. The thing continued to reach for him, imploring him to come forward, a low, guttural moan escaping its rotten throat.
What are you?
He raged. With a jerking motion, the corpse twisted around to face him and began to slowly crawl forward, hand over broken hand, dragging her bisected body along the floor, blood and old gore smearing the path behind her. Each hand fell in time with a paralyzing metallic knock that echoed in his skull.
Just stay there. I'll come back.
He shouted. The sound, which had always been so consistent, started to speed up, while the creature in turn crawled faster and faster.
Just wait. I'll fetch the medic,
he called out. Her hauntingly pained expression slowly twisted into a snarl of pure anger and hatred. Tears welled up in her bloodshot eyes and poured down her cheeks. The sight of her like this was like a stab to Elloth's guts. He fired the first shot, hitting her in the shoulder, causing the thing to spin backwards, but it ultimately had no effect. She turned back and continued her pursuit, crawling faster and faster. He fired 3 more rounds and stumbled back, but it did nothing to slow her down. The knocking was so loud now. It echoed from everywhere all at once and hammered inside of his skull like a pneumatic drill. The creature was gaining on him, moving with supernatural speed. He couldn't outrun it, but he had to try. He broke into a sprint, slapping away pipes and ducting. Terror had its icy grip around his heart, and in his panic, he completely lost track of which way he had come. The generatorium was a labyrinth of overlapping tunnels that were easy to get lost in. She was right behind him. He could hear her teeth gnashing together to the beat of the knock. He turned a corner and found himself at a dead end, but there before him were not the doors back out. Instead, he was standing in front of an absolutely ancient and abandoned void lock, its first set of doors sliding open of their own accord, as if in promise of salvation. The danger didn't even register to him. He didn't care. He just had to reach it. He had to get away. He felt the thing's arms clutching at him. He screamed and whirled around, becoming entangled in a nest of wires. He kicked out at her and threw the cables off of him, literally throwing himself the last few feet into the void lock. His heart was hammering in his chest, and he was paralyzed with fear. Everything seemed to slow down, and he thought for sure that she would make it inside with him. But at last, the door slid shut just in the nick of time. And once again, he was alone, listening to the pounding in his head and the knocking at the void lock door. He heard the doors, maglocks engage, and everything in his world finally stood still. There was an icy chill on his back as the freezing temperature of the void seeped through the closed second set of doors behind him. With a mechanical and detached motion, he reached forward and began to punch in his code to open the void gates. A warning lumen flashed overhead, and an overhead klaxon wailed in alarm. He turned his back to the door that separated him from the creature and waited for the void to suck him out. He felt the cold grip of the void completely envelop his body as all the moisture that had surrounded him in the air suddenly froze. In a sudden rush, he was sucked out of the void lock, the vacuum violently pulling the air from his body in a soundless rush as the gases trapped inside him expanded. His eyes exploded, and his tongue grew so big it closed off his airways. His suit ripped open, and his skin stretched from the pressure. He hung in the air like an inflated toy, his viscera vaporizing and freezing within seconds. It took him 15 seconds to black out, and in those final moments, the only thought echoing through his mind was that the knocking, that terrible, horrible, incessant knocking, had finally stopped. 90 seconds later, his body finally died, and his lifeless corpse, surrounded by rings of his own frozen viscera, drifted away into the darkness. Moaz finished his glow stick, smooshed it down into the ashtray, and headed out of his chamber. After Elloth had disappeared, he searched through his belongings, trying to find some reason for his erratic behavior, but he had left nothing behind, not even a note. But he did find something strange under his cot, an old picture of the Emperor with its eyes scratched out. Elloth had never struck him as a heretic, but then again, even if he had been, the boss had always kept things close to his chest. The image was certainly creepy, but there was something else about it that left him deeply unnerved, something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. He crumbled it up into a ball and meant to throw it away, but without thinking, he instead slipped it into his back pocket. He walked down the hallway towards the mess hall. It was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the drills below and a strange tapping coming from somewhere deep within the complex. Medic Dune was the only one here, All of the other men had already left for their shift. The medic held the stub of his own low stick between pinched and trembling fingers. After one final drag, he dropped it on the floor and crushed it underfoot.
Hey, can you hear that?
Moez said. Dune slowly exhaled a cloud of smoke.
Yeah. What is it?